Well, my name's Philip Couchman. I joined the Conservancy in 1974 and I retired about 5 years ago as the manager of the AONB. In the early days, of course, Chichester Harbour as we know it today was two harbours. It was split into Chichester side and the Emsworth side, and they had two harbour masters, they had two speed limits, they had different scale of charges. And so in the early days, particularly in 1974 onwards, when times were fairly hard financially, it was very important to get together a proper management structure. And I was really appointed on a temporary basis by the first manager and harbour master, Ian Mackay, because the levels of harbour due payments were relatively low, to the extent that the precept is the amount of money provided by the local authorities to the Conservancy, was really used to cover the costs of running the harbour. And so I was brought in, as I say, only as a temporary appointment to assist Ian Mackay in increasing the overall level of harbour due payments. And there were a number of ways of doing that. One was to go around with a great huge sheaf of printouts, and then carefully flick through the printouts whenever you found a boat to find out whether he'd paid or not. And if you hadn't paid, then you could impound the boat. And that was so time consuming and so slow that we decided, in fact it was Ian Mackay decided, that all boats who'd paid should display a sticker. And that's something which all the boats in Chichester Harbour do now, and that made it much easier to go around. If the boat didn't have a sticker, he was presumed not to have paid. The landscape of the harbour is important because of its naturalness, and it's prized because in the sort of the overgrown southeast of England, the overdeveloped southeast of England, it's still one of those few places where you can get a sense of wilderness. Sadly, back in the 70s, it was quite obvious, and early 80s, that the fringe of trees around the shoreline, which gave it its natural appearance, were slowly being eroded by the waves. And although they still remained attractive, they clearly had a much shorter life. And so we started a process then, a landscape enhancement program, which has been now running, and it continues to run for the best part of 20 years, to replace these trees by moving the line of trees backwards so that we could accommodate movements in the harbour. You can't stop change, you can't stop the harbour changing, and that would be foolish and impossible. But what you can do is you can manage the change so that you don't get you get the same sense of the harbour, irrespective of what shape it might be or how it might look. It's the experience which is important, and that's what we set out to do, to maintain the experience but allow the harbour to change naturally. I think it's worth remembering after 40 years that the Conservancy couldn't have achieved all it has achieved without a huge amount of support. In the very early days, I think the major landowners around the harbour, the farmers, were hugely supportive and gave us a lot of their time, a lot of their land to plant trees on, and really developed a relationship with the Conservancy, which I think has been one of the buttresses that's enabled us to do as much as we have done, because the Conservancy doesn't own any land. It does all it does by consent. But not only the local landowners, the Conservancy's had a huge amount of support from voluntary organisations, from non-voluntary organisations. One of those non-voluntary organisations was a team of 4 prisoners who would come out every Sunday. I would get in the Land Rover, drive down to Ford Prison. They would give me their little ticket, which was their day release. They would get in the Land Rover and we'd drive to some part of the harbour and we'd spend the day picking up litter. It was beneficial to the harbour. I think it was beneficial to them by and large, because it really did get them out to a lovely spot. And and it was one of the more amusing sides to volunteer work, because they didn't look like prisoners. They just looked like ordinary volunteers, walking along and picking up litter and putting into plastic bags. And then occasionally we get the odd walker coming up and saying, "Oh, aren't you chaps doing wonderful work? Fancy giving up all your time just to do this?" And that was nice. That would make them laugh. But not only forward prisoners, we had for a large number of years during the times when unemployment was high. I think I mentioned it earlier. We had a team of about 12 people working almost full time as part of the long-term unemployment schemes, which was run by the government. It was organised through West Sussex County Council, but we had a completely autonomous team. And that enabled us to do a lot of stuff. We did a lot of tree planting, of course, but also we did some selective work around the shoreline where there were problems associated with erosion that was causing perhaps the loss of a footpath, and we could help improve that footpath. And we shouldn't forget Chichester Conservation Volunteers. They were formed I think more than 25 years ago, and some of the first work that they did was in the Harbour, and they still today work doing very important work, tree coppicing in Saltons Copse and hedge laying and working on footpaths. Of course, today the Conservancy has a huge support body in the Friends of Chichester Harbour, with I think getting on for 2,000 members, and they provide a very strong support both in terms of labour and also in terms of finance for the Conservancy. But in those early days, the forward prisoners, the long-term unemployed, the Chichester Conservation Volunteers, the local landowners were absolutely critical, because we certainly couldn't have achieved half of the work that we did do without that level of support.